I didn't plan on spending the night in the old cabin. I was only there to check out the abandoned farmstead for a photography project I'd been working on, somewhere on the outskirts of rural Vermont. It was the autumn of 1987, the kind of fall where the wind felt sharp enough to cut through layers of clothing, and the smell of rotting leaves mixed with damp earth hung heavy in the air. I was 22, broke, and stubbornly determined to get a few genuine shots of the place before the sun set. The cabin itself had been standing for over a century, a relic of some long-forgotten homestead. The roof sagged like it might cave in any moment. The paint had long peeled away, leaving bare, gray wood streaked with moss. The windows were mostly shattered, leaving jagged teeth of glass that glinted faintly as the fading light caught them. I parked my beat-up Honda along the dirt path leading to the structure and stepped out, my boots sinking slightly into the wet, muddy ground. The wind whistled through the surrounding woods, carrying with it the faint creak of old branches and the distant sound of a crow or two. As I approached, I noticed the remnants of farm equipment scattered around. A rusted plow half buried in dirt, a wheelbarrow tipped over, handles rotting. The air smelled of old wood and mildew, and the silence was thick, almost heavy. I tried to keep my camera steady as I took a few shots from the exterior, imagining how alive the place must have been decades ago, bustling with livestock, people, and endless labor. By the time I felt like I had enough photos, the light had dimmed considerably. A gray, almost bluish twilight had settled in. I realized the cabin's interior might provide some unique shots. I pushed open the front door, which groaned so loudly it made my stomach tighten. Inside, dust hung in motes in the last of the fading light, drifting lazily in the weak beam from my flashlight. The floorboards were warped and uneven, creaking with every step. Old farm tools were scattered around, some leaning against the walls, some half buried in cobwebs. I moved cautiously, shining my flashlight around. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper that had once been a floral pattern, now faded and brittle. A table sat in the center, covered in dust, with a few cracked plates and a rusted kettle. A fireplace dominated one corner, blackened from soot that had long since stopped being useful. I felt a chill creeping up my spine, though the air wasn't cold. It was that sense that the place had been abandoned suddenly, almost violently, though I knew logically that it was just decay. I set up my camera on a tripod near the fireplace, trying to capture the cabin's interior with the soft light filtering through the broken windows. As I adjusted the lens, I noticed something strange. The back corner of the cabin had a small door, almost hidden behind an old armoire. I had thought it was just a closet, but something about it seemed deliberate. Curious, I moved closer. The door was warped and swollen, but it opened after some struggle. Inside was a small, dirt-floored cellar. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of damp earth, old sweat, and something I couldn't name. I shone my flashlight down into the cellar. Wooden crates and old sacks were stacked along the walls. Some had rotted completely, spilling their contents. Old potatoes, dried beans, a few animal bones. The deeper I looked, the more I realized this cellar wasn't just storage. It was organized almost carefully, though clearly it had been abandoned for decades. Then I noticed the floor, uneven, scuffed, as if someone had dragged something heavy across it. My stomach tightened. I knew no one had been here in decades, and yet the marks looked fresh. I took a step back, trying to tell myself it was just the wood settling, an optical illusion, anything to calm my racing thoughts. I focused on the camera, convinced I needed a few more shots before heading back to town. But then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound from deeper in the cellar. My heart froze. My mind tried to reason. It could have been a branch falling outside, the wind, anything, but my gut screamed otherwise. The sound was deliberate, slow, like someone or something was moving along the ground. I wanted to run, but I was rooted in place. I forced myself to shine the flashlight all the way into the far corner. Nothing. The crates and sacks were just shadows. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and told myself I was imagining things. I had to get a shot. I slowly stepped down into the cellar, the cold, damp air clinging to my clothes. Each step echoed off the walls. I kept my flashlight steady, my camera dangling around my neck. Halfway across, I saw it. A faint glimmer in the corner, a reflection off something metal. I froze and my heart skipped. I edged closer. It was a small, rusted lantern, lying on the ground as if someone had set it down and forgotten it. That explained the drag marks. Maybe it had rolled. Relief mixed with tension, but it didn't last. As I reached for it, I felt the floorboards shift slightly beneath me, as though someone or something was moving just out of sight beneath the surface. I jumped back, and the lantern clattered across the floor, rolling near the wall. The sound of movement stopped. The silence was thicker than before. My rational mind screamed that it was probably just an animal that had made its way into the cabin through a broken wall. Maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. But another part of me knew that wasn't quite right. I had been inside enough old barns and cabins to recognize animal sounds, and this wasn't it. It had been purposeful, observant, waiting. I decided I had to leave. Slowly, cautiously, I climbed back up to the main floor, keeping my flashlight trained on the back corner where the cellar door hung open. Each step was measured, careful not to make noise. I could feel the cabin's atmosphere pressing down on me, like it was aware of me in a way that was suffocating. Once I reached the main floor, I didn't look back. I grabbed my camera, slung it over my shoulder, and ran outside. The wind hit me hard, the smell of wet leaves and earth filling my lungs. I didn't stop until I was back at the car. I jumped in, slammed the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook as I wiped sweat and dirt off my forehead, even though the air outside was cold. I didn't check the rearview mirror until I was halfway back to the main road. The cabin sat there, dark and silent, its broken windows staring at me like empty eyes. The wind rattled the remaining boards on the roof, and I could swear I saw movement in one of the shadows near the cellar door. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small cluster of lights that felt impossibly safe. I parked, sat in the car, and breathed slowly, trying to convince myself it had been imagination. But I knew. I didn't need proof. I knew something had been there, watching, waiting, something that didn't belong to the world I understood. I never went back, never tried to take more pictures, never even drove past that road again. The photos I had taken were blurry in places, grainy, almost as if the cabin itself didn't want to be captured. And looking at them later, I noticed something I hadn't while taking them. A faint, dark shape in the corner of the cellar frame, indistinct, almost like a shadow crouched low to the ground. I still don't know what it was. Maybe I'll never know. All I know is that the oldest farm cabin in Vermont had been alive in its own way, and it didn't want company. That night, I slept with the lights on. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows reminded me of what I had left behind. I never went back to abandoned cabins again, and I never planned to. But the memory of that place, the smell of rot and mildew, the drag marks in the dirt floor, and the feeling of being watched will stay with me for the rest of my life. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that slow, patient presence waiting just beneath the surface. I drove north toward a remote ridge in northern Colorado during the fall of 2016. I was 30 years old back then, and I had been planning a solo hunting trip for months because I wanted a quiet escape from the noise of my job and the city. I left before sunrise, and the highway was almost empty. The mountains were already getting snow, even though it was still October, and the sky looked heavy, like a storm was waiting. I felt a strange excitement that I could not explain. I just wanted silence and fresh air. The cabin I booked was small and old, built sometime in the 1960s, and the owner told me it was mostly used by hunters during elk season. I read that there were no neighbors for 5 miles, and I liked the idea of being alone. I packed simple food, warm clothes, a first aid kit, a rifle, extra ammunition, and a small radio that barely worked outside the city. I left my phone in the truck most of the time because there was barely any service that far into the mountains. When I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, the air smelled like wet pine and freezing mud. The road was rough and narrow, and I could feel rocks hitting the bottom of my truck. When I saw the cabin, I felt some relief because the road made me nervous. It sat in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. The wood looked dark and old, and the window shutters were crooked. Smoke stains around the chimney made it look burned at some point, but I knew it was just age and weather. Inside, everything was basic. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table, a sink connected to a rain barrel outside, and a shelf filled with old canned goods. The floor felt uneven under my boots. I put my bags down and walked around to get used to the place. I checked the locks, even though I knew it was pointless when you were that far from people. My plan was to hunt elk for 2 days and stay 3 nights. The first day went normal. I walked deep into the woods, following animal tracks, but I didn't see anything worth shooting. The trees blocked most of the wind, but every now and then I heard something move far away, probably deer or maybe a fox. Nature noises never bothered me, but something about those woods felt too quiet. I kept telling myself it was because I wasn't used to being alone like that. I usually hunted with friends, but that year they were all busy. I returned to the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun dropped behind the ridge quickly, and the temperature fell fast. I started the wood stove, and the smoke smell filled the room. I ate canned soup, listened to the radio for a few minutes, and tried to relax. The wind picked up and pushed against the cabin walls. I thought I heard thin branches scratching against the window, but I told myself it was normal in the mountains. I went to bed early because I wanted to wake before sunrise again. During the night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was slow and heavy, like something walking in the snow. I didn't move at first. I just lay there listening, trying to control my breathing. I could not tell if it was an animal or maybe the wind pushing something across the ground. My heartbeat got louder inside my ears, and I felt sweat forming even though the air was cold. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I didn't want to get up. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The second day, I woke with a stiff neck and tired eyes. I stepped outside and saw footprints in the soft snow near the cabin. They were larger than deer, but not clear enough to identify. Maybe an elk passed during the night. That was normal, so I tried not to think about it too much. I walked farther than the day before, climbed a ridge, and sat behind a fallen tree waiting and watching. Around noon, I heard something moving far behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see an animal. I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. After a moment, I noticed a shape standing between 2 trees. It looked like a person, but I told myself it was only a tree trunk. I stared at it for a while, and the longer I stared, the more it seemed like someone wearing dark clothes. I felt a heavy feeling in my stomach, like something was wrong. Then I blinked, and it looked like a tree again. I didn't see any reason to stay there after that, so I packed up and walked back slowly, turning around every few minutes even though I didn't hear anything following. When I reached the cabin, I felt a strong urge to go inside and shut the door. I tried to focus on normal things. I collected firewood, melted snow for water, cleaned my rifle, and checked the window latches even though the weather wasn't that bad. I looked at the tree line more than usual. I didn't know why. My instincts felt like they were trying to tell me something I couldn't explain. When night came, everything felt tense. The wind got louder, and snow began to fall hard. I sat awake for hours, listening to branches snap somewhere in the darkness. I felt like someone was close, watching the cabin, waiting for me to fall asleep. I could not see anything through the windows because of the snow. I kept the rifle near my bed, and I didn't sleep until early morning. I woke up late on the third day. My hands felt shaky, and my throat felt dry. I decided I was done hunting and that I would leave in the morning instead of staying another night. I walked outside to take fresh air and calm myself, but then I noticed new footprints in the snow. They were human. They came from the trees, circled the cabin, and stopped at the back door. My stomach tightened so hard that I felt sick. I kneeled down and looked at them carefully. The stride looked normal, human length, and the shoe marks looked old and worn. Someone was out there walking around my cabin in the night. I pulled all my gear inside and shoved a chair against the door even though I knew it wouldn't stop much. I kept the rifle close. The entire day I sat near the window watching the tree line. I didn't want to move. Every tiny sound made my muscles tense. I saw nothing, but I felt watched the entire time. I kept trying to tell myself maybe a hiker got lost or maybe someone came there before me. But that didn't explain why they walked around the cabin quietly at night instead of knocking on the door. When darkness came again, I felt a fear I had never felt in my life. I shut off the stove so the cabin wouldn't glow from the chimney. I sat in the dark with only a small flashlight pointed at the floor so it wouldn't shine toward the windows. Hours passed. The wind slowed. Everything got too quiet. Then I heard snow crunch outside. Slow, steady steps like someone trying not to make noise. I held my rifle tight and pointed it at the door. I felt my heart banging against my ribs so hard I thought I might faint. I tried to control my breathing, but my chest felt stuck. I heard the steps circle the cabin again. They stopped at the back door. The handle moved a little, as if someone was testing it. I felt a cold wave run down my back. I didn't move or make a sound. I stayed like that until the steps moved away. I listened for a long time. I don't know how long. When the sun finally came, my whole body felt numb. I packed everything fast. I didn't care if I forgot something. I walked out with the rifle ready and didn't look toward the trees. The snow around the door had fresh prints exactly where I heard the person. I started the truck and drove away as fast as the rough road let me. When I reached the highway, I stopped and looked back toward the mountains. I told myself it might have been someone hiking or someone living in the woods illegally, maybe watching cabins for supplies or trying to see if anyone was there. But the way they moved, the way they walked around quietly during the night and tested the door without saying anything, that didn't feel random. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the hunting gear that winter. I still like the outdoors, but I stay near other people now. Sometimes I think about those footprints circling the cabin while I slept. I picture someone standing outside, watching through the cracks, waiting for the right moment to come in. It makes me sure of one thing. I was not alone out there, not even for a minute, and whatever or whoever was moving around the cabin had been watching me the entire time. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the constant noise of New York City and escape to a remote cabin in northern Vermont. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college, and working a job that I hated but needed for rent and bills. The idea of being completely alone in the woods, away from phones, traffic, and the endless rush of people, seemed like a perfect way to reset my mind. I found the cabin listed in a small-town newspaper in Montpelier. The ad was simple: a 2-room wooden cabin, 5 miles from the nearest road, no electricity, and a nearby lake. The owner mentioned it was perfect for solitude, though he warned that the surrounding area could be wild, especially in the fall. I laughed it off at the time, imagining deer wandering past the porch and crisp air at night. I packed my old Jeep with blankets, food, and enough firewood to last the week, and drove north with anticipation. The drive itself was a small adventure. The highway quickly turned into narrow back roads, twisting through hills blanketed in orange and red leaves. By the time I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the dense trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I parked at the edge of a small clearing where the cabin rested. It was small, built from rough timber, with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were dusty, but the structure seemed solid enough. The first night, I built a fire in the stone fireplace. The logs crackled and popped, filling the cabin with warmth and a faint scent of smoke that mingled with the earthy smell of old wood. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans and a tin of corned beef, and sat on a rickety wooden chair staring at the flames. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a constant whisper that seemed peaceful at first. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew sharper. Branches snapped, leaves scuttled across the ground, and every so often, I thought I heard a low thud as if something large was moving just outside the cabin. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just a deer or some other wildlife. I had read about bears and coyotes in Vermont, and while I hoped to see some from a safe distance, the idea of them so close to my cabin made me uneasy. I slept with the door locked and a knife on the floor by my bed. I told myself that was just precaution, normal for someone staying in the woods alone. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. A narrow path led toward the lake, about half a mile through thick forest. I noticed broken branches, deep scratches on tree trunks, and oddly placed piles of stones that looked like markers. At first, I didn't think much of it, attributing it to natural causes or animals. But then I saw tire tracks in the mud, fresh ones, leading from the nearby dirt road into the woods. They were too narrow for anything but a small truck or ATV. What bothered me was that the tracks didn't continue to the road. They ended abruptly near the tree line, as if someone had parked and walked into the forest. I brushed off the unease and returned to the cabin. That night, the wind was stronger, and the sounds outside seemed louder, closer. At one point, I woke to a heavy thump on the roof, like someone dropped a log. My heart raced and I stayed frozen, listening. Then, I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel in the small clearing outside the porch. I couldn't see through the dark windows, and my first instinct was to hide behind the chair. The sounds stopped after a few minutes, leaving only the wind. I convinced myself I was imagining things and forced myself to sleep. By the third day, the isolation began to gnaw at me. The forest that had seemed inviting now felt like it was closing in. I went out to gather firewood and noticed more signs that someone, or something, had been nearby. A trail of footprints led from the cabin toward the lake. They weren't human. They were larger, like boots, but deep and heavy, leaving an impression in the soft dirt. My stomach turned when I realized they were fresh, only a few hours old. I picked up a stick and carried it with me while I finished collecting wood. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush made me tense. That night, I heard the most unsettling sound yet. A slow, deliberate scratching at the cabin door. It wasn't the random scratching of a raccoon or a bear clawing to get inside. It was precise, almost methodical, as if someone was testing the lock. I gripped the knife and waited, my ears straining. The sound continued for minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it started. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed what I could carry and headed back to my Jeep. The dirt path that had seemed manageable earlier now felt treacherous. Leaves and mud made it slippery, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain someone was following me. By the time I reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat, I saw tire tracks again. Not just one set this time, multiple crisscrossing in the clearing. They were fresh, as if someone had been circling the cabin during the night. I jumped into the Jeep and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing at the tree line. I didn't, but the unease stayed with me for days. I never returned to that cabin, and when I told people about it, many laughed it off as paranoia. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Years later, I discovered through local news archives that the area had been frequented by a small group of people living off the grid, involved in illegal hunting and minor thefts from cabins like mine. The evidence suggested they would often monitor nearby properties, waiting for anyone to stay alone before entering or vandalizing the place. I realized then that the footprints, the tire tracks, and the scratching at my door weren't imagination. They were deliberate acts. I had been lucky, very lucky. That experience stayed with me. I learned to respect isolation and wilderness in a way I never had before. Nature is beautiful, but it's not forgiving. And sometimes, the real fear doesn't come from ghosts or legends. It comes from real people, real intentions, and the uncomfortable realization that you are not as safe as you think, even in what seems like the middle of nowhere. I never went back, but I sometimes drive through northern Vermont during fall. The winding roads, the red and orange leaves, they're still beautiful, but I always remember that cabin, that week, and the way the forest can hide more than just wildlife. Sometimes, when I see a cabin deep in the woods, I can't help but glance at the trees around it, imagining what might be lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I never imagined I would find myself drawn to that part of the forest, but there was something about the old maps I found in my grandfather's attic that called to me. They were yellowed and brittle, with markings I didn't fully understand at the time, but one thing stood out: a small, abandoned cabin marked deep in the northern woods of Maine. I didn't know why I had to see it, but I packed my bag one cold October morning in 1987, determined to find it. I was 23, alone with just my old backpack, a rusty hunting knife I'd borrowed from my dad, a few cans of food, and a small kerosene lantern. The forest was dense, older than anything I had ever walked through. Pine trees towered above me, their branches forming a roof so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The air was damp, carrying the earthy smell of decaying leaves and moss. Every step I took felt heavy, like the forest itself was trying to warn me. There were no clear trails, just narrow deer paths and broken twigs underfoot. I marked trees with chalk where I could, trying to avoid getting lost, but I soon realized that the forest didn't want to be mapped. I first saw the cabin as the sun was starting to sink behind the hills, casting everything in long, jagged shadows. It was tucked in a small clearing, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dead, gnarled trees. The structure was small, maybe 15 feet by 20, made of thick logs that had turned gray over time. The roof was sagging badly, one corner nearly touching the ground, and the windows were either broken or boarded up. I could see the remnants of a stone chimney on one side, though it was blackened and cracked, as if a fire had long since gone out. I approached slowly. Every step brought a creak under my boots, the sound too loud in the quiet forest. The air around the cabin felt colder, damp, and stale. I could smell rot and something else I couldn't quite place. Old smoke mixed with the scent of decaying wood. I pushed open the door carefully. The hinges protested with a loud squeal, and I had to brace myself against the frame to avoid falling into the darkness inside. The interior was worse than I expected. The floor sagged in places, and dust covered everything like a thick carpet. There were old wooden furniture pieces scattered around, broken chairs, a table with one leg missing, and a small cabinet with its door hanging open. I noticed jars on a shelf, long emptied, their glass cloudy with age. The fireplace was filled with ash, and on the wall above it, a layer of soot had formed patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had traced shapes with their fingers decades ago. I kept thinking about who had lived here and why they had left so suddenly, leaving everything behind. I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. I went to the back room, which looked like it might have been a bedroom. The bed frame was bare, only a few torn pieces of fabric clinging to the rusty springs. There was a small trunk in the corner, its lid stuck fast with rusted hinges. After a few minutes of struggling, I managed to pry it open with my knife. Inside were old clothes, brittle and yellowed with age, a few cracked photographs, and some handwritten notes. The handwriting was shaky, faded almost beyond recognition. I could make out a few words here and there. Mentions of food running out, cold winters, and a stranger at the edge of the trees. My stomach tightened at that last line. I kept moving cautiously, aware that the floor might give way beneath me at any moment. I stepped into what I thought was a second small room, but the floor creaked ominously, and my foot slipped on a rotten board. I grabbed the wall to steady myself and froze. There, partially hidden under a pile of broken wood, I saw a hand, bony, dried, and blackened with rot. My heart stopped, and I could feel sweat forming on my back. The realization hit me slowly. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. Someone had died here, long ago, left to decompose in the cold silence of the forest. I stepped back carefully, my mind racing. The body had likely been there for decades, hidden by the collapse of the floor and the overgrowth outside. I didn't want to touch anything else, didn't want to disturb the silence that seemed to press against me from every direction. I moved back toward the main room, my eyes scanning for more signs of life or death. Every creak and crack of the old wood made me flinch. I could hear the wind outside, rustling through the trees, but it sounded almost like whispers. My hands shook as I lit the lantern. Its weak, flickering light illuminated more of the cabin, revealing old farming tools, a rusted metal bucket, and the remnants of a water container that had long since rotted. I spent the night there, though I slept fitfully. I couldn't leave the lantern too close to the old wooden walls, worried it might start a fire. I wrapped myself in a thin blanket I had brought and tried to make the cabin feel safe, but every shadow looked like it could move. The wind moaned through the cracks in the logs, and the broken windows rattled as the cold night air pushed through. I could hear branches scraping the roof, and at one point, I was sure I saw a shadow move across the far wall. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Morning came slowly, a gray, muted light that did little to ease the sense of isolation. I packed up my things carefully, making sure not to disturb anything else. As I stepped outside, the forest looked different. It felt emptier, quieter, as if the cabin had drained it of something. I realized then that the story of the cabin wasn't in ghosts or legends, but in its silence, in the weight of time and neglect. The cabin had been abandoned not because of some fairy tale curse, but because life had simply moved on, leaving a person behind who hadn't been able to survive the harsh winters and isolation. I made my way back to the path I thought I had marked, relying on memory and the faint chalk marks. The hike back was long, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching me from the trees. But there was nothing, just the forest, endless and indifferent. By the time I reached the small town where I had parked my car, I was exhausted, sunburned from the reflection of the morning light on the frost, and covered in scratches from the underbrush. I never returned to that part of the woods, but the cabin stayed with me, not as a haunting, but as a reminder of the fragility of life, the passage of time, and how easily people and places could be forgotten. I told a local ranger about it months later, showing him the map. He nodded grimly and told me that sometimes people just vanished up there. The cabin would likely collapse entirely in a few years if no one went back, leaving nothing behind but memories buried in the forest floor. I can still picture it clearly. The sagging roof, the broken windows, the smell of rot and damp air, the hand half buried under the floor. That place taught me something about survival, about the quiet terror of being truly alone, and about how real fear doesn't need ghosts. It's in the silence, in the cold, in the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was trapped by the world and time, and no one ever knew it. And yet, despite the fear, there was a strange clarity in the morning when I left. I understood the forest a little better, understood the cabin, and understood that leaving it alone, untouched, was the right choice. Life moves forward, even if it leaves death behind. And sometimes the best ending is just walking away and knowing you survived something that had long forgotten it was dangerous. I didn't mean to end up in the middle of nowhere, not really. It was late October 2007, and I had rented a small cabin in the northern part of Vermont. I was 29, and the idea had been simple. Leave the city, escape the noise, get some work done, and maybe do a bit of hiking. The listing had promised a secluded, peaceful cabin, perfect for writing. And I'd imagined a small wooden structure tucked between the trees, maybe a little fireplace, and a porch overlooking a quiet clearing. I got more than I bargained for. The drive up had been long and tiring. A storm had started in the late afternoon, turning the narrow forest roads slick and dangerous. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white as rain hammered the windshield. The map on my GPS was flickering, a weak signal flashing every few minutes, and every turn seemed to take me deeper into the forest. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I finally spotted the cabin, its dim exterior light barely cutting through the sheets of rain. The cabin itself looked exactly like the pictures at first glance. Weathered logs, a small porch, the roof sagging slightly from age. There was a stone chimney on one side and a stack of firewood leaning against the wall. The door rattled a little in its frame as I opened it, but it held. Inside, the place smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The lights were weak and yellow, but at least they worked. I set my backpack down on the floor, shaking off the rain. I went straight to the fireplace, fumbling with the old iron matches and kindling I found stacked nearby. It took a few tries to get the fire going, and by then, the sound of the rain had grown into a steady roar. It pounded on the roof, drummed against the walls, and I could hear the occasional drip from a loose shingle overhead. As I settled into an armchair with my laptop, I realized just how isolated I was. No neighbors, no cars, nothing but trees and the storm. The only sound other than the rain was the wind whistling through the gaps in the logs. It was peaceful at first, in that quiet, untouched way, but soon the silence started to press on me. Every creak of the old cabin floor, every snap of a branch outside, made me flinch. I tried to focus on my writing, but my mind kept wandering. I kept glancing at the windows, watching the rain run in sheets across the glass. Around midnight, I heard a noise that made me freeze. A sharp, deliberate knock at the door. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might burst. The storm was so loud that I was sure I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. 3 quick raps, firm and controlled. I didn't move at first. Whoever or whatever was outside, I told myself, couldn't see me. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone taking shelter from the storm. I debated ignoring it, but after a moment, curiosity, or maybe just fear, got the better of me. I went to the door slowly, my bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and peered through the small window. Nothing. I waited, tense, listening. The storm made everything sound distorted. Branches scraping, rain slapping the roof, and then I heard it again. Soft, shuffling footsteps circling the cabin. They stopped at the far side, near the stack of firewood. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they were moving quietly, deliberately, and they weren't calling out or making any noise beyond that. I backed away from the door, heart hammering. My first instinct was to call the police, but my cell had no signal. I thought about driving to the nearest town, but the rain had turned the dirt roads into mud, and in the darkness, I wasn't sure I could make it. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon I could find, and moved to the window, trying to see through the rain. Shadows shifted in the trees, and I caught a glimpse of a figure crouched near the woodpile. I couldn't see clearly, but I could tell it was a person. They weren't dressed like a hiker. No jacket, no gear, just dark clothing that blended into the night. Time stretched. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the trees, the rain. I watched the figure slowly stand, then start walking toward the back of the cabin, keeping to the shadows. I tried to think clearly. I had no idea why they were there, or if they meant me harm, but I knew staying put was dangerous. I remembered the firewood by the fireplace. I grabbed a piece and shoved it into the fire, letting the flames roar to life. The light spilled through the front windows, and for a moment, I thought I saw the figure hesitate. That gave me a small surge of hope. Maybe they hadn't realized the cabin was occupied. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I had to get to my car. Slowly, quietly, I moved to the back door, keeping low, trying not to make a sound. The figure had moved again, closer to the side of the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall and waited, listening. Every second felt like a minute. Then, lightning flashed, illuminating the figure for an instant. Tall, thin, moving cautiously. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I slammed the back door open and sprinted across the slick ground to my car. Mud clung to my shoes and pants. Rain soaked through my jacket. I fumbled with the keys, heart racing, and finally got the engine to turn over. The headlights cut through the rain, and I saw the figure stop at the treeline, watching. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I drove down the muddy road, slipping and sliding but moving as fast as I dared. The storm made it nearly impossible to see, but after a long, tense drive, I finally reached the highway. From there, I called the police, explaining as calmly as I could what had happened. They told me they would send a patrol to check the area. The next day, when I returned with the authorities, the cabin was empty. No sign of the figure. Nothing had been stolen. The firewood was untouched, the windows unbroken, the door locked. The officer said it was likely someone hiding from the storm, maybe a transient, but the way they moved, the way they watched the cabin, it didn't feel random. I didn't stay in Vermont much longer after that. I went back to the city, shaken but grateful I had escaped without physical harm. The cabin stayed in my memory for years after. The sound of rain on the roof, the smell of damp wood, the shadow moving just beyond the firelight. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. It was real flesh and bone, and it had been clever, patient, and quiet. That's what made it terrifying. The storm, the isolation, the darkness, they were all enough to make a person feel small, insignificant, and exposed. And that night, I had learned exactly how vulnerable we can be when nature and another human being combine against us. Even now, thinking about it, I can still hear the rain hitting the roof, the wind whistling through the trees, and I remember that cold, raw fear in my chest when I realized I wasn't alone. But I also remember the relief, the sense of clarity when I finally drove away, exhausted and soaked, but alive. The ending was clear. I survived because I stayed calm enough to act, observant enough to notice patterns, and determined enough to escape. That night changed the way I looked at solitude. I still go to cabins, still escape to forests sometimes, but I never underestimate the power of being alone in the dark, with the storm outside and someone watching from the shadows. And I never forget that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones without any monsters at all. Just humans, rain, and a night that feels endless. I remember the summer of 2018 when my neighbor, Claudia, and her husband, Greg, invited me to their cabin up in the northern reaches of Maine. I had lived in the area for almost 10 years, but I had never ventured that far north, where the trees seemed older, denser, and the air had a sharp, raw smell of pine and earth. I was 28 at the time, Claudia was in her early 40s, and Greg was a bit older, maybe 45. Their cabin was tucked away behind a thick wall of spruce and fir, a place that looked like it had been untouched for decades. I drove up in my small Jeep, the gravel road bouncing the car wildly as I followed the faded trail that Greg had texted me about. When I arrived, the cabin was exactly as I expected. Wooden, weathered, and surrounded by a thin clearing where the sun barely penetrated through the thick branches. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. I parked, and the couple greeted me with smiles, though I remember feeling a slight unease. There was something off, not in them personally, but in the way the property felt. It was isolated, yes, but not in a scenic, relaxing way. It was the kind of isolation that pressed in on you, that made ordinary sounds, like leaves brushing together, feel loaded with intent. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and wood polish. The floors creaked under every step, and the windows rattled in their frames, though the air was still. Greg showed me the small living area, the fireplace stacked with logs, and the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Claudia handed me a mug of coffee, but it was bitter, over-roasted, and I could barely swallow it. I told myself it was probably the water from the well, which they said was perfectly safe. The first day passed uneventfully. We explored the small area around the cabin, walking past thick brush and moss-covered boulders. I noticed how Greg kept looking over his shoulder whenever the wind moved through the treetops, and Claudia seemed to follow his gaze each time. There were moments when I could see their hands twitch slightly when branches snapped in the distance, or when a bird suddenly called out. I chalked it up to the natural tension of being deep in the forest. That night, I slept on a small fold-out mattress in what was essentially an enclosed porch. The walls weren't fully sealed. You could see the night sky through gaps in the wood, and the air was cold and heavy. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something dragging across the floorboards. My heart jumped. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but the sound continued, deliberate, heavy. It wasn't light or skittering. It was slow, methodical, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, listening. Eventually, it stopped, and silence returned. Morning didn't make it feel any less real. When I told myself I just imagined it, Claudia and Greg acted normal, though Greg kept checking the locks on the doors multiple times that day, muttering under his breath. The second night was worse. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard the floor creak again. This time it was followed by soft, deliberate knocks against the wall of my makeshift room. Not just random taps, but measured, like someone trying to signal me or test my presence. I stayed perfectly still, telling myself it was the wind or the old structure settling. But when I looked toward the small window facing the woods, I swore I saw a shadow move past. By the third day, I realized the tension wasn't coming from the cabin itself. It was coming from Greg. He began waking before sunrise and pacing the living room. His eyes would dart to the trees as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. He was polite to me, even friendly at times, but his demeanor was fragile, tight. Claudia seemed tense too, quieter than usual, always following him with her eyes. I tried to maintain normal conversation, but it felt hollow. Every time I laughed or tried to talk about the outside world, it was like I was intruding on a secret they both shared. Then came the incident that made me realize this wasn't a normal trip. We were chopping firewood outside when Greg insisted we go deeper into the woods to get a special log he had marked earlier. It was farther than I expected, the trees growing so thick that the sky disappeared. The forest floor was uneven, covered with moss and fallen branches that made each step precarious. I was tired, but Greg insisted, dragging the log behind him. Suddenly, he stopped. He crouched low, listening. Claudia froze beside him. My heart pounded as I noticed the way he signaled me to stay quiet. A rustle came from somewhere ahead, from a patch of thick underbrush. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like a deer or a fox. It was heavier, slower, deliberate, moving closer. Greg reached into his jacket, gripping the handle of a small axe. Claudia's hand went to his arm, but he shook it off. I wanted to speak, to ask what was happening, but my voice refused to come. The rustling grew louder, and I could hear the snapping of twigs under heavy steps. Greg signaled for me to move back toward the cabin, staying low, dragging the log with him. We moved silently, but I felt the presence, whatever it was, tracking us, keeping pace without revealing itself. By the time we reached the cabin, the sense of being watched didn't vanish. Inside, Greg locked the doors and barred the windows. Claudia moved quickly, checking each lock again, her hands shaking. That night, none of us slept. I sat in the corner, my back to the wall, listening as Greg whispered instructions to Claudia in a tense, clipped voice. He told her to keep a weapon nearby, to never leave the cabin alone, to always check the perimeter. The forest had eyes, he said. I didn't question it at the time. I didn't want to seem ignorant or foolish. We stayed in that cabin for a week. Every day, the sense of being watched grew stronger. We heard footsteps outside, dragging sounds, occasional branches breaking as if someone, or something, was testing us. Greg grew more paranoid, pacing in the living room, keeping the axe close. Claudia became quieter, almost withdrawn, only speaking when necessary. On the last night, it all culminated. I was lying on the mattress when I heard the loudest, closest steps yet, pounding across the clearing. The cabin shook with the impact. Greg immediately grabbed the axe and opened the door, while Claudia followed him with a flashlight. I stayed behind, frozen with fear, until I heard Greg shout something into the darkness. It was a poacher, a local man who had been tracking their property for weeks, hoping to steal supplies, possibly worse. Greg had seen him in the forest earlier, and the sounds of the previous nights were him scoping out the cabin. The man ran, disappearing into the trees. Greg and Claudia checked every inch of the property until dawn. By then, the tension broke. We were all exhausted but alive. The morning we left, the forest seemed calm again, but I could feel the residual fear clinging to the trees, lingering in the air. Driving back down the gravel road, I realized I hadn't spoken a single word for miles, still digesting what had happened. Claudia and Greg had invited me to their cabin for what should have been a peaceful retreat, but it turned into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I never returned. I kept in touch with them for a while, but the story of those nights stayed with me. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was fear, raw, real, and human, and it was enough to change how I viewed isolation forever. I never thought I'd find myself back at my grandma's cabin after all these years. It had been nearly a decade since I'd last been there, and now, in the late fall of 2012, I was driving the narrow, winding road through the hills of northern Vermont, trying to make sense of the sudden inheritance of her old property after she passed away. My name is Lucas, and at 28, I had moved around enough to forget the rhythm of that place. The creak of the old pine floors, the smell of damp earth mixed with smoke, the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees. The cabin had always felt more like a relic than a home, worn and stubborn. But it was hers, and now it was mine. The drive up the hill had already set my nerves on edge. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving the trees skeletal against the gray sky. The road was narrow and almost invisible under the decaying foliage, the kind of path where if you went too fast, you'd miss a turn and plummet into a ditch. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would shake the car, and I'd catch myself gripping the steering wheel tighter. I remembered Grandma's warnings about these hills, about how easy it was to get lost if you weren't paying attention. She'd always said, "The forest isn't mean, Lucas. It just doesn't forgive carelessness." I laughed at the memory, but now, alone in my little sedan with the sun fading fast, her words had a sharper edge. The cabin finally came into view as the last light drained from the sky. It hadn't changed much except for the obvious wear and neglect. The roof sagged slightly on one side, the wooden siding had darkened with age, and the windows reflected the dimming sky like watchful eyes. I parked my car on the uneven dirt patch beside the cabin, listening to the wind push through the surrounding pines. There was a strange quiet beyond the sound of the trees, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting. I reminded myself it was just the isolation talking. Inside, the cabin smelled exactly like I remembered. Old wood, damp earth, and the faint scent of tobacco from years past. Dust lay in thin layers across every surface, and a small pile of old newspapers in the corner crumbled at the edges. I ran my hand along the banister leading upstairs, feeling the grooves worn deep from decades of use. Everything seemed frozen in time, like Grandma had stepped out for a moment and would return any second. The thought gave me a strange comfort, but also an uneasy awareness that I was completely alone here. I spent the first hour just walking through the rooms. The kitchen had the same cast iron stove, its black enamel dulled but intact. I opened cupboards and found mismatched mugs and plates, some with chips on the edges, all of them coated in a thin layer of dust. The living room smelled faintly of wood polish that had long since dried, and the faded floral curtains hung unevenly, moved by drafts that snuck through the cracked window frames. I pulled the windows closed, the cold seeping into my fingers as the last of the daylight faded. As night approached, I lit the old kerosene lamp on the table. Its flickering light cast long, uneven shadows across the walls, and suddenly the cabin felt smaller, more crowded with things I hadn't noticed in the daylight. That's when I first heard it. A faint scratching like nails or claws against wood, coming from the back of the cabin. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening. It was deliberate, not random, moving slowly along the floorboards above me. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound was heavier, more measured than any animal I could imagine. My rational mind struggled against a creeping sense of dread. The cabin wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be mine now, safe and silent except for the wind. I tried to ignore it and went to check the supplies in the shed outside. The cold night pressed against me as I stepped out, and the shadows from the trees looked unnatural, stretched long by the thin moonlight. The shed was exactly as I remembered. Old tools leaning against the walls, a pile of firewood stacked carefully in the corner, and a broken wheelbarrow. I grabbed some logs, planning to light the fireplace, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Fresh, heavy footprints pressed into the soft dirt around the cabin. They were human-sized and led directly from the tree line to the side door, but stopped abruptly at the threshold. My heart pounded. There was no way anyone else was supposed to be here. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. I stepped inside quickly and locked the door, but the scratches upstairs began again, louder this time, moving from one end of the house to the other. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the shed and moved cautiously toward the stairs. The lamp trembled in my hand, casting dancing shadows across the hallway. Every step creaked under my weight, and I realized I had no idea what I would do if someone, or something, was really up there. I reached the top landing, listening. The scratching stopped. Silence fell so sharply that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I went from room to room, opening each door slowly. Nothing. The bedrooms were empty. The old blankets lay folded neatly, untouched. The windows were all shut tight. I exhaled slowly, my body still trembling. I decided to try and sleep, convincing myself that it had to be animals and the old wood settling. I piled some blankets on the couch, keeping the lamp close. Hours passed and finally exhaustion pulled me under. But I woke in the middle of the night to a different sound, soft breathing. Not mine. It was coming from the corner of the living room. Faint, shallow, deliberate. I froze again, heart hammering, wrench in my hand. I could barely make out the shadow, a subtle shift where the lamp light didn't touch. I slowly rose, stepping toward it, and as I did, the breathing stopped. Absolute silence returned. I scanned the room again. Nothing. The thought hit me that maybe someone had been watching me all evening, hiding, waiting. The fear rooted me to the spot for what felt like an eternity. Morning came, gray and cold, with the sun struggling to rise above the hills. I forced myself to step outside, scanning the perimeter carefully. The footprints were still there, leading back into the trees as if whoever had come had melted into the forest overnight. My unease didn't fade. I gathered my belongings quickly, realizing I wasn't safe sleeping here alone. Not yet, anyway. I drove back down the hill, the leaves crunching under the tires, and vowed to return with friends or perhaps someone from the local sheriff's office if I decided to reclaim the cabin fully. I never found out who or what had been there that night. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen items, no explanations beyond those heavy, human footprints and the eerie noises that had haunted me. I reported the footprints to the local sheriff weeks later, but they said they had no one missing in the area. I can only guess someone had been exploring the abandoned cabin at the same time, maybe a drifter or someone living in the woods. The thought both calmed and haunted me. The forest didn't forgive carelessness, as Grandma had said, and now I knew exactly what she meant. The cabin, the isolation, the dark corners of the land, all of it had a presence of its own. You couldn't predict it and you couldn't control it. The woods took what they would, and the only thing you could do was respect them. Weeks later, I returned with 2 friends and a small generator. We repaired the windows, patched the roof, and fortified the doors. I stayed longer that time, lighting the fireplace every night and keeping watch over the property. Nothing happened again. The fear faded gradually, replaced by the cautious respect I had always ignored as a child. The cabin became mine in more than just legal terms. It became a reminder of boundaries, of the hidden rhythms of the natural world, and of how fragile safety really is in a place that feels abandoned. Every creak, every gust of wind, and every shadow reminded me that the forest didn't need to be mean. It only needed to exist, and that was enough to keep you wary, alert, and alive. From that point on, the cabin was no longer just a relic of Grandma's life. It became a place where I felt the weight of the land, the reality of isolation, and the tangible fear that comes from understanding just how small you are in a vast, indifferent world. And despite the fear, despite the scratches and shadows, I never let it go. It was mine now, and I had learned how to respect it. I had been working as a park ranger in the Amazon basin for almost 5 years by 2019. I was 27 then, fit and used to the heat and humidity, but nothing really prepares you for the isolation you feel when you're deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest road or radio signal. I had spent most of my days patrolling the protected areas, checking for illegal logging and poaching, and maintaining the small, scattered ranger stations that dotted the region. One of these stations was at a remote part of the forest, by a wide river that curved around a cluster of old-growth trees. The station was essentially a small cabin on stilts, built decades ago by a conservation group. It was made of dark wood, with a steep metal roof, a tiny veranda, and an old solar panel that struggled to keep the lights on at night. The cabin was isolated. The nearest settlement was a 4-hour boat ride downriver, and there was no cell reception. Only the forest, the river, and the occasional passing wildlife. I was assigned to spend 2 weeks at this cabin in late September, a season when the rains were just beginning to taper off, but the forest was still soaked and heavy with humidity. I had stocked up on supplies in the nearest town, which included canned food, dry rice, some vegetables, and bottled water. I also brought a small first aid kit, my machete, a flashlight, extra batteries, and my old hunting rifle, more for reassurance than necessity. I didn't expect to need it. Predators were rare around the station, though jaguars and caimans were always possible in the region. The first few days passed quietly. The forest was alive with the constant buzz of insects, the occasional screech of howler monkeys, and the water slapping against the riverbank. I spent my days marking trails, inspecting traps that poachers had left behind, and cataloging trees. Evenings were quiet, spent cooking over a small gas stove and reading by the dim light of my lantern. At night, the forest felt different, almost alive in a way that made your skin crawl, but it wasn't dangerous. It was just the solitude pressing in. It was on the 5th night that things started to feel wrong. I had gone to bed around 9, the usual routine, but I woke around midnight to the sound of footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps, but something heavier, deliberate, slow. I froze. The cabin's windows had no bars, only shutters, and the veranda creaked lightly as if someone was leaning against it. My first thought was that it was a Capuchin monkey or maybe a coatimundi, but the rhythm of the steps didn't match any animal I knew. I stayed still, listening, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I turned on the flashlight, pointing it out the window. The beam caught a shadow disappearing behind a tree. My chest tightened. The river was too far for anyone to come by boat unnoticed, and the dense forest made approaching the cabin silently almost impossible. Whoever or whatever it was had knowledge of the terrain. I didn't sleep much that night. I spent hours sitting in the darkness, listening to the subtle movements outside. Snapping twigs, low rustling, the soft sound of wet leaves shifting. I checked my rifle several times, making sure it was loaded and ready. When dawn finally came, I crept outside, machete in hand, and checked around the cabin. There were footprints, large human footprints, muddy from the damp forest floor, leading up to the veranda and then disappearing back into the trees. Whoever had been there hadn't taken anything. That was the oddest part. I decided to stay inside for the next day, marking the edges of my territory from the veranda and scanning the tree line. The sun was hot, the air heavy, and sweat ran down my back, but the sense of being watched never left me. By the evening, I had a plan. I would patrol the surrounding area, keeping close to the river where I could retreat to the cabin quickly if needed. The patrol was uneventful at first. Birds flew away as I pushed through the thick undergrowth, and I caught sight of a few small mammals. But after about 2 hours, I noticed fresh signs of someone, or something, tracking me. Broken branches, prints pressed deep into the mud, and small disturbances in the foliage suggested a person had been following my path but keeping hidden. My stomach sank. I returned to the cabin faster than usual, my machete swinging at low branches as I went. That night, I barricaded the doors as best as I could with furniture. I even wedged the door with a metal rod from the veranda railing. I slept fitfully with the rifle across my lap. Around 2 a.m., I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Slow, deliberate knocking on the door. Not soft, not playful. Knocking that was loud, heavy, and consistent. Whoever it was testing my defenses. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I gripped the rifle tighter, listening as the knocking stopped, replaced by silence. then the sound of footsteps retreating slowly into the forest. The next morning, I checked the area again. Footprints had vanished, and there was no sign of anyone hiding nearby. But there were marks on the door frame, deep scratches, as if someone had tried to force entry. I realized then that I couldn't stay idle. I gathered my supplies, planned a route to the nearest village, and decided to move at first light. The path was difficult. The forest was dense, and the riverbank was slippery from the rain. I kept the rifle ready, listening to every sound, moving slowly to avoid stepping on anything that could give away my position. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless. The sun climbed high, beating down, but I couldn't stop, couldn't rest. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing where the river bent sharply. I spotted a narrow, overgrown trail leading toward the village. As I approached, I heard voices, low, muffled, urgent, but I couldn't see anyone. I paused, heart hammering. Then I saw movement. 2 men, carrying machetes, crouched behind a fallen tree. They were poachers, judging by the traps and cages I had seen in the past few days, and they had been watching the cabin, waiting for me to leave. I stayed crouched behind a rock, holding my rifle steady, calculating my next move. I waited until they moved downriver, distracted by something else, probably another patrol route. I took my chance, sprinted down the narrow trail as fast as I could, slipping through roots and mud. After 2 hours of running, my legs aching, I reached the village, exhausted, soaked, and trembling. I reported what had happened to local authorities, and a search team went back to the cabin. They found no one there, but they did confirm the footprints, the forced entry marks, and signs of someone having stayed hidden in the area. After that experience, I never returned to that part of the Amazon. I kept working as a ranger, but the cabin, and the way someone had tracked me without being seen, stayed in my mind. It was a terrifying reminder of how vulnerable you could be in the forest, even when you thought you were alone. I had escaped, yes, but it was by luck and quick thinking, not by skill. That cabin taught me that danger in the wilderness doesn't always come from animals or storms. It sometimes comes from other humans, patient, silent, and invisible, watching, waiting, and knowing the land better than you ever could. It was the autumn of 1998 when I decided to take a break from the city and drive out to the mountains of northern Vermont. I had been working long hours at a publishing firm in Burlington, and the noise, the deadlines, and the constant hum of people wearing serious faces had finally gotten to me. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin I had read about in a local flyer, spend a week alone in the woods, chop some firewood, hike the trails, and maybe fish in the river that ran past the property. It was supposed to be quiet, restorative, and utterly peaceful. I rented an old Subaru, packed some supplies, and drove north from Burlington. The roads narrowed and wound around steep cliffs and dense forests. The air grew colder, carrying that crisp smell of pine and damp earth. Eventually, the asphalt ended, turning into a rutted dirt road that disappeared into a thick canopy of trees. My map indicated that the cabin was just a few miles down, but the road was barely visible under fallen leaves and muddy patches. I remember thinking that this was probably the kind of place people only found if they knew someone who knew someone. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The cabin sat in a small clearing, half hidden by tall oaks and maples. It was a one-story log structure, weathered and darkened by years of rain and sun. A thin trail of smoke rose from the stone chimney. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle, the boards warped and creaking under my boots. I parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the cold, wet air. There was a stillness in the forest that made me uneasy, like it was holding its breath. I opened the cabin door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a cot pushed into the corner. On the wall hung some rusty tools: a hatchet, a saw, and a set of axes. I assumed the previous owner had been a woodsman, someone who lived off the forest. The floor was covered in a layer of sawdust, and in the fireplace, old ashes were scattered, cold and gray. I decided to make a fire. I found some dry kindling in a basket by the door, stacked it carefully, and struck a match. The flames caught quickly, and the cabin filled with warmth and a flickering orange glow. I sat back and listened to the forest outside. The wind rustled through the trees, branches scraping against the roof, and somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out. I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. This was exactly what I needed. Around evening, I went outside to gather firewood. That's when I first noticed it. A hand, pale and stiff, protruding from the pile of chopped wood near the back of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, staring at it. The fingers were thin and claw-like, the nails darkened, dirt crusted around the knuckles. I forced myself to take a step closer. The body was mostly hidden under branches, logs, and leaves, but I could see the outline of a man. His head rested against the base of a tree, twisted at an unnatural angle. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I crouched and examined the figure more closely. He was old, maybe in his 60s, thin, wearing a flannel shirt and corduroy pants. His face was pale and covered in a layer of grime, eyes open, staring blankly at the sky. There were no obvious signs of struggle or blood, just the eerie stillness of a body that had been left there for weeks, maybe longer. I stumbled back into the cabin, my mind racing. I needed to call someone, the authorities, the local sheriff, anyone. My cell phone had no signal. I thought about driving down the dirt road to find help, but the sun was already setting, and I didn't know if I could make it safely in the dark. I felt trapped, the forest closing in on me. As night fell, I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself. I couldn't stop thinking about the man outside. How long had he been there? Who was he? I noticed that some of the tools on the wall were worn, scratched in patterns that looked like they had been used recently. The axe especially caught my attention. It had wood chips and dark stains along the blade. I couldn't tell if it was blood or just rust, but it made my stomach turn. Around midnight, I heard a sound outside, a low, dragging noise. My heart jumped. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it out the window, but saw nothing but shadows shifting among the trees. The wind had picked up, and leaves skittered across the clearing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the sound persisted, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being moved across the ground. I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I grabbed a jacket and stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it clearly. The body of the man wasn't alone. Nearby, partially covered by leaves, were other remnants. Tools, a broken chair, signs that someone had been living or hiding things here. I realized with a sinking feeling that the cabin wasn't just abandoned. Someone had been using it, maybe even killed this man. The thought made my skin crawl. I retreated into the cabin and barricaded the door with a chair. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to every sound: the wind, the cracking of branches, the distant howl of a coyote. Couldn't sleep. I felt watched, though I saw nothing. By morning, the first light revealed more details. The ground around the cabin was churned, as if someone had been digging. Footprints led from the woods to the back of the cabin, then vanished. Finally, I managed to get my car started and drove down the dirt road to the nearest town. I reported the body and the cabin to the sheriff. Later, I learned that the man was a local woodsman named Harold Keene. He had gone missing months before, and nobody had found his body until that day. The sheriff explained that someone in the area had been using the cabin to hide him, and evidence suggested foul play. They had recovered fingerprints and traces of someone else's presence, but never found the killer. The story haunted me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harold's pale face, the cold, lifeless stare, and the oppressive stillness of that cabin in the woods. But there was a strange sense of closure too. I had found him in a way, even if I hadn't saved him. It made me realize how fragile life can be, how easily someone can disappear, and how the world carries secrets in quiet places like that. Years later, I drive past that area on road trips, and I remember the cabin. It's gone now, torn down by the authorities, the forest slowly reclaiming the clearing. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I think I hear the faint scrape of old tools, and I remember that cold, still morning when I discovered the truth hidden among the firewood. The memory is vivid, unsettling, and strangely grounding. It reminds me that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, danger and death can be closer than we think. I still go to the woods now, but I never stay in cabins alone. I carry a phone, a radio, and a hatchet of my own. The memory of that night taught me to respect the forest, the solitude, and the unknown. Life is fragile, but awareness, preparation, and caution can make a difference. That cabin, Harold's body, and the forest itself are burned into my memory, a grim reminder of reality's darker edges, but also of survival, resilience, and the importance of never taking safety for granted. I drove to the mountains in northern Wyoming during the late autumn of 2019, hoping I could get away from everything for a while. I chose a small rental cabin that sat behind a slow creek and thick pine trees, far from any town. The man who rented the cabin to me online said it was once used by hunters, and that it had a working wood stove and a hand pump well beside the porch. I wanted silence, open land, and some time away from my phone and people. At that time, I was 26 and tired of city noise and the routine I had been dragging myself through. I remember thinking the place looked calm, and the pictures showed nothing strange, just old wood and a thick roof. The drive up there took most of the day. Clouds were low, and the air felt colder than the weather report predicted. The cabin was smaller in person, and the wood looked older, darker, and more weather-beaten than the photos online. The ground around it was messy with brown needles and wet soil. A long fence ran behind the property, half broken in places like animals had tried running through it over the years. When I got out of the car, the woods felt extra quiet. Not peaceful, just strangely quiet, like everything was waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and cold air. The stove was metal and rusty around the lower half, but still solid. The bed was nothing more than a mattress on a wooden frame, covered with a thick blanket that felt like it had been folded in a closet for too long. I dropped my bag near the wall and tried to ignore how dark the windows looked. Even during the afternoon, the trees blocked most of the light, so I turned on an old lamp near the little table. The first night started normal. I boiled some canned soup, sat at the table, and listened to wind outside. Around midnight, I began noticing strange sounds from the woods. At first, they were just quick snaps of branches, like deer moving, but after a while the noises came in slow steps. I tried to tell myself it was just animals. There were plenty of deer around, maybe even elk, and I knew this was hunting country. I pulled the blanket high and tried to sleep. At some point, I woke up again. My phone showed it was after 2 in the morning. There was a low sound coming from outside, something like an animal trying to moan or cry, but it didn't sound right. It sounded too close. The sound stretched in a weird way, like someone trying to copy an animal without really knowing what it sounded like. I stayed still, staring at the dark window, telling myself it could have been a coyote or something injured. The sound stopped after a while, and I finally fell asleep again. The next morning, I walked behind the cabin and saw tracks near the edge of the trees. They didn't look like deer prints. They looked like boots, deep in the mud, and they came close to the back porch, then turned around. I tried brushing it off, thinking maybe someone was hiking. Maybe the person who owned the land sometimes checked the place. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I tried to forget about it. That night, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. I tried to sleep early, but the same noise started again. This time it came from one side of the cabin, like someone or something was circling slowly. Every few minutes I heard a low moaning sound, sometimes longer, like it was trying different tones. I felt my stomach tighten every time I heard it. There was something practiced about the sound, like a human trying too hard. I kept telling myself they were animals, but the steps were too heavy at times, too slow. I didn't get much sleep that night. On the third day, I found more footprints, again boot-shaped, but this time I noticed something else. They were older prints mixed with newer ones, like someone had been coming around here more than once, maybe even before I arrived. Some went toward the creek, then disappeared among stones. I checked my car just to be sure nothing was touched, and nothing looked disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the idea that someone was watching the cabin. During the afternoon, I tried to enjoy the woods. I walked toward a clearing, looked at the mountains, listened to wind through tall branches. The air felt sharp and clean, but I couldn't relax. I kept turning around every few minutes because I felt like someone was following from a distance. Each time I stopped, the woods were quiet, too quiet again. By evening, the temperature dropped further and a thin fog moved between the trees, making everything look more closed in. I sat inside, stove lit, trying to read a book, but my mind kept wandering back to the footprints. I thought maybe there were hunters around who came closer because they were tracking something. That seemed possible, but it didn't explain the strange sounds. That night became the worst. I lay in bed listening to the wind and the cracking wood of the old cabin. Then the sounds returned. The moaning came louder, closer, and suddenly sharper, like someone was trying a different kind of animal sound. For a moment, it sounded almost like a person trying to speak, but the voice was twisted, stretched, and wrong. I felt fear moving through my body in a slow wave. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe deeply. The sound moved along the wall, and footsteps came onto the porch. Heavy steps, measured, slow. I stared toward the door, feeling like whoever was out there was also staring directly at it from the other side. My heartbeat felt loud, too loud, like the thing outside could hear it. After a long time, the steps moved away. I could hear them retreat into the woods, breaking small branches. I stayed awake until the first light. When I finally gathered the courage to open the door, I stepped out slowly. There were fresh boot prints on the porch right up to the door. They were deep, and I could see the pattern of the rubber sole clearly, which meant someone stood there for a while. I didn't stay another night. I packed my bag fast and loaded the car. As I backed down the dirt trail, I checked the tree line constantly. The woods looked still and calm again, like nothing had happened, but the silence felt heavier, like something was waiting behind it. On the drive back, I stopped at a small gas station near the highway. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, noticed the mud on my boots and asked if I had been out near the northern ridge. I didn't answer with words because I didn't want to talk about it, so I just kept looking at the road. The man didn't push me to answer, but he looked like he understood something. Maybe other people had seen things or heard things out there. Maybe I wasn't the only one. When I got back home, I tried to search online for reports from that area. I found old stories, not supernatural, just warnings from hikers about strange human activity, people mimicking animal sounds at night, people walking near camps without being seen clearly. Some called them skinwalkers, but not in a supernatural sense. Just people hiding in the woods, possibly unstable, copying animal noises to scare travelers or to lure them. Some posts mentioned missing livestock, trespassers, strange prints around cabins, and campers leaving early just like I did. I realized the word skinwalker didn't have to mean something unreal. It could mean someone who wanted to pretend, someone who studied animal behavior and learned how to copy the sounds, someone who moved through dark woods and watched people from outside their cabins. A person hiding behind trees at night can be far more terrifying than anything supernatural. I never returned to that cabin. I deleted the rental contact from my phone and avoided that entire region after that. Even now, sometimes when I try to sleep, I remember that slow, twisted sound outside my wall, and I picture someone standing in the dark, waiting quietly, learning different tones, trying to sound less human. I still think about how close they came to the door and how long they stood there listening. I understood then that some places look peaceful, but silence can hide things you never want to meet. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster, but another person, just a few inches away, pretending not to be one. It was the autumn of 2018 when I decided to take a short break from my hectic life in London. I'd been working long hours at a small publishing house, the kind of job where every day blended into the next, and sleep came in fits of exhaustion rather than rest. I remembered seeing a small listing online for a secluded cabin in the Scottish Highlands, somewhere near Loch Laggan. The pictures looked cozy enough. Stone walls, a little fireplace, a kitchen with copper pans, and a tiny porch overlooking thick woods. It seemed perfect, a quiet retreat to catch my breath and think. I didn't care that it was a few hundred miles from London or that I'd be alone. The idea of solitude was intoxicating at that point. I drove up north in my old Honda, the one with the scratch along the passenger door that never seemed to disappear. The journey was long, and the landscape shifted gradually from the rolling green of the lowlands to the jagged hills and dark pines of the highlands. By the time I reached the tiny village near the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains, casting a soft gold over the lochs and hills. There was a silence here, one that was almost physical, pressing against your ears and making the usual city hum feel like a distant dream. The cabin itself was further in, accessible only by a narrow gravel road lined with birch and oak trees. When I arrived, the place looked even better than in the photos. Smoke was curling from the chimney, the windows were dimly lit by the fading sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I parked the car and got out, stretching and breathing in the cold, clean air. It was peaceful, or at least it should have been. The front door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood polish and something else I couldn't identify. Old paper, maybe, or dust that had settled over decades. I dropped my bag by the staircase and wandered through the rooms, marveling at the little details. The carved wooden banister, the small rugs in front of the fireplace, the tin lanterns hanging from hooks. I lit a fire, placed a kettle on top, and sat in the worn armchair near the hearth, letting the warmth spread through my frozen fingers. Outside, the wind was picking up, rustling the trees and making the whole cabin groan in response. It was around 6 o'clock when I first saw her. I was standing by the window, watching the fading light turn the sky a dull orange, when a figure appeared in the clearing across the small field behind the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor or a traveler, but there was something wrong about the way she moved, too slow, almost floating, and she didn't seem to belong. Her hair was long and dark, tangled and matted as if it hadn't been combed in weeks. Her clothes were faded and dirty, an old coat over a dress that hung unevenly. I couldn't see her face clearly, but there was a weight to her presence, a heaviness that made my stomach tighten. I stared at her for a long moment, half expecting her to disappear, and then she turned and walked toward the tree line. I felt a chill run down my spine, the kind you get when your instincts scream that something isn't right. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just someone passing through, or maybe a local who lived too far off the beaten path. But there was a sense of watching, like she had noticed me noticing her. I locked the doors and drew the curtains. It wasn't paranoia, I just felt safer that way. I stayed near the fire for the next hour, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I made a cup of tea, put on some music, and tried to calm down. By the time darkness fully settled, the wind had turned into a steady howl. Shadows danced across the walls of the cabin, twisting with the flames in the fireplace. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see her again, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the thin layer of frost outside the cabin, starting at the edge of the field and leading toward the back door. They weren't deep, but they were fresh, just made, judging by the way the frost around them was disturbed. My heart raced. I didn't hear anyone coming up to the cabin, but the footprints were unmistakable. They stopped at the back door, just shy of the threshold. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and quietly moved to the door. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped it. The back door was locked, thankfully, and the glass panes showed nothing in the shadows beyond. I waited for what felt like hours, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. My mind was racing, imagining all the worst-case scenarios. Robbery, violence, the kind of things you read about in the news and tell yourself only happen to other people. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound, like nails scraping against wood, coming from the far side of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, the part of me screaming to run, the other part insisting I stay quiet and think. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local police number, but the signal was weak, barely enough to make an emergency call. The line was dead. I spent the rest of the night in that armchair, the poker across my lap, watching the windows and listening. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement outside, shadowy shapes slipping between the trees. The scratching returned periodically, moving around the cabin, circling me without ever revealing itself fully. Sleep was impossible. When the first light of dawn came, I was exhausted, cold, and trembling. By morning, the footprints were gone. The frost was untouched. There was no sign of her anywhere. I checked every inch of the cabin, even the surrounding woods for a few meters, but nothing. No footprints in the soil, no tracks in the grass. The only evidence was the memory of that night, the fear that I couldn't explain. I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, and drove back toward the village. On the way, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her following me on the road, but the road was empty. When I finally reached the main highway and the village receded behind me, the tension started to ease. By the time I got to Inverness for lunch, I could finally breathe without the constant awareness of eyes on me. It took me years to even mention that night to anyone, and even now, I'm not sure I completely understand what happened. The cabin was real, the footprints were real, and the sense of being watched was real. I never returned to that part of the Highlands. The memory stays with me, but in a strange way, it also made me more cautious, more aware of the world when I'm alone. Looking back, I realized the ending was simple. I survived because I trusted my instincts. I didn't confront her, didn't follow the urge to investigate. I stayed inside, locked doors, stayed quiet, and eventually the danger passed. There was no dramatic showdown, no heroic fight. Just me, making careful choices and waiting it out until daylight and safety returned. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones that don't follow rules, the ones that appear and disappear without explanation. That night taught me that fear is a tool, and when you respect it, it can keep you alive. It was the fall of 2007, and I was 24, fresh out of college and desperate for a break from the endless buzz of city life. I'd grown up around the mountains of western Montana, so the idea of a long weekend in a cabin deep in the Bitterroot Range felt like the perfect escape. I had a small backpack, a camping stove, and enough food to last me 3 days. The cabin was mine for the weekend, rented through a local outfitter who swore it was off the grid, meaning no cell service, no Wi-Fi, nothing to tether you to the world. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was quiet, the roads winding and empty. Leaves in shades of amber and burnt orange fell in slow spirals from the trees lining the narrow path. My car's headlights swept over occasional signs of life. A deer frozen at the edge of the road, a scattered flock of crows taking off with a cawing rush, but mostly, it was just me and the forest. After about 2 hours, the asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, and the air grew colder. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, I could barely hear anything but the wind brushing through the pine needles and the faint creak of trees adjusting in the gusts. The cabin itself was small, built of weathered logs that had darkened over decades. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were small, fogged over from years of moisture. There was no electricity, no running water, just a single wood-burning stove and a stack of firewood outside. It smelled of old pine and something earthy, almost damp soil that had crept in through cracks in the walls. I set down my pack and unlocked the door, feeling a little thrill of excitement. This was exactly the kind of isolation I craved. I spent the first hour unpacking and organizing, lighting the stove and setting my food away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old shutters. I could hear branches scraping together, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods. At first, it was comforting, this raw connection to the wilderness. But as the sun dipped below the ridges, casting long shadows across the clearing, I began to feel the first hints of unease. The silence was heavy, unnatural almost, the kind that pressed against your ears until you notice every tiny sound. The scuttle of something small across the forest floor, the distant rattle of rocks tumbling down the hillside. I decided to make a fire in the stove to push back the darkness. The logs hissed and spat as they caught flame, and I sat in the flickering light, reading a worn paperback I'd brought along. Time passed slowly, the kind of slow that made you hyper-aware of everything. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed it. The sound of crunching gravel outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was my imagination. There was only one road in, and I knew I hadn't seen any cars for miles. The crunching stopped, then started again, slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze. My first instinct was to tell myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the pattern of the steps was too heavy, too careful. They weren't random. They were measured, pacing around the cabin as if someone was circling it, observing. My heart began to race. I grabbed my backpack, feeling for the small hatchet I had packed. There was a window to my left, one I could climb out of if it came down to that. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear through the thin walls. The steps stopped. Then, from the other side of the cabin, there was a faint knock. Not loud, just a soft tap on the logs. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the wind. I could feel it in my bones. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was alone. I debated what to do. Shouting for help was pointless. No one could hear me out here. The nearest road was miles away, and there was no phone signal. My mind raced through every horror scenario I'd ever read about. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that most people wouldn't just wander into the woods to terrorize someone. But the knock came again, louder this time, and I could hear a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. I made the decision to stay put. I couldn't see them from the windows, so I moved the stove to the center of the room to give myself a barrier, and I held the hatchet tight. The wind outside seemed to intensify, as though it were trying to push the intruder closer. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the logs settling, made me flinch. I felt the hours stretch into eternity. Around midnight, the noises finally stopped. I didn't sleep, not really. I just sat with the fire dimming, listening for the slightest sound. By the first hint of dawn, the forest outside had grown still again. I waited another half hour, then cautiously opened the door. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just the leaves, scattered by the wind. I packed up immediately. I didn't want to risk staying another night. I left the cabin exactly as it was, locking the door behind me. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every rustle, every movement at the edge of the headlights set my nerves on edge. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't need to. The memory of the circling steps, the taps against the cabin, followed me the entire way. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over at a gas station to catch my breath. I noticed a small local newspaper on the counter, and the headline made my blood run cold. Asterisk, hiker missing in Bitterroot Mountains. Authorities search for clues. Asterisk, the description matched the area I had been in almost exactly. I checked the date 3 days ago. The pattern of the missing hiker, the fact that someone could have been out there lurking near the cabin. It all clicked into a terrifying reality. I had come within hours of crossing paths with someone who might not have had any intention of letting me leave alive. After that weekend, I never went back to the mountains alone. I told no one at the time, afraid they'd think I was exaggerating. But the fear stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind every time I drove past a forested road or saw a cabin tucked away in the trees. I realized how fragile the illusion of safety really is when you strip away society, roads, and other people. Out there, it's just you and the wilderness, and sometimes whatever else happens to be out there too. Years later, I've learned to trust my instincts more. I double-check locks, I avoid isolated rentals, and I always tell someone exactly where I'm going. That weekend in the Bitterroot Mountains taught me a lesson about awareness, about respect for the unknown that isn't supernatural but is very real. The world can be dangerous, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of other people, and sometimes the wilderness itself hides them. And that's what I remember most. The circling steps, the faint tapping, the absolute silence that followed. A reminder that I wasn't alone, even when it seemed like I was. That encounter didn't end with a scream or a chase, but it ended with clarity. Some places, some situations, demand caution, and sometimes the only way to survive is to leave before curiosity gets the better of you. It was the summer of 2007 when I decided to take a solo trip up to the northern woods of Maine. I had just turned 24, fresh out of college, and I wanted something quiet, somewhere to clear my head after a messy breakup and a few months of soul-crushing office work. I rented a small, isolated cabin near Moose River, a place a friend had recommended years ago. He had warned me that cell service was spotty and that I should prepare for silence, but I thought I was ready for it. I wasn't. The drive up was long, twisting through narrow roads lined with dense pines, their trunks rising like dark pillars. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, spilling a dull orange glow over the gravel driveway. The cabin itself was older than I expected. Built from thick logs, the wood darkened with age and dampness. Moss clung to the roof and the windows had that old, slightly warped look that made everything inside seem soft and crooked. It had a charm, though, and I was too tired to care. I spent the first night unpacking, lighting a few candles because the cabin's single overhead light flickered inconsistently. The wind whistled through cracks in the walls, and I remember hearing what I first thought were branches scraping against the cabin. But as I lay in the small bed in the corner, I realized the sounds didn't stop. They moved. They weren't random branches. Something was out there, walking slowly, deliberately, around the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or a raccoon, something harmless, but my stomach twisted with unease. The next morning, I explored the surrounding woods. I wanted to convince myself I wasn't imagining anything. The forest was thick and still, the ground soft with pine needles. There was a small creek about 100 yards from the cabin, and I followed it for a while, the sound of running water oddly soothing. But I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every so often, I thought I saw shadows moving between the trees, too deliberate for deer. I brushed it off, telling myself it was paranoia. The second night was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin doors and windows. I was sitting on the small couch, reading a book by candlelight, when I heard it, a slow, heavy thump on the back wall. My first thought was a falling branch, but then another thump followed, deliberate and heavy, like someone testing the structure. My heart rate shot. I grabbed the largest flashlight I had brought and crept to the door at the back of the cabin. The thumps stopped the moment I reached for the handle. I stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp in my lungs. The forest stretched in every direction, dark and silent. I shone the flashlight around, following the beam across the trees and underbrush. Nothing. No movement, no animals, nothing at all. I told myself I was imagining it, a trick of the mind in a place this isolated. But my instincts screamed that something was off. I went back inside and locked every door and window, even though the cabin was already locked. I didn't sleep much that night, listening to the faint crackle of the wind and every small noise outside. By the third day, I decided I would take a short hike to shake off the tension. I packed some water and snacks, and I left the cabin, making sure to note how far I was walking so I wouldn't get lost. The trail was overgrown, barely visible, and the deeper I went, the heavier the silence became. About a mile in, I came across a small clearing. The sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered rays, illuminating the forest floor. It felt almost peaceful until I saw the footprints. They were human, barefoot, and large, fresh, judging by the dampness of the mud. They led deeper into the trees, directly away from the cabin. My stomach dropped. I had no phone reception to call for help, no way to reach anyone if something went wrong. Every logical part of my brain told me to turn around and go back immediately, but my curiosity, and a foolish hope that maybe it was just another hiker, pushed me forward. I followed the trail until I reached the remnants of a fire pit. Old cans, scorched wood, and bits of charred cloth. It looked like someone had been here recently, maybe even living off and on. I froze. The thought of someone potentially watching the cabin while I was gone made my skin crawl. I turned to leave and froze again. Among the trees, I thought I saw movement. Slow, deliberate, crouched. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. Branches lashed at my face. Roots grabbed at my feet. But I kept running until I broke the tree line and saw the cabin. When I got back, I bolted inside, locked the door, and sat pressed against it for what felt like hours. I didn't hear anything else that night, but I didn't dare sleep properly. Instead, I sat awake, flashlight by my side, watching the darkened woods through the windows. The next morning, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed everything hastily, heart pounding. As I was loading my car, I noticed the back door of the cabin. It was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. Inside, nothing was disturbed, no signs anyone had been there. But the lock was broken, the latch bent. Whoever or whatever had been out there had come close enough to test the door. I didn't stop to think. I drove back down the winding roads, not once looking back. The forest seemed to close in behind me as I gained speed, the morning sun cutting through the fog that had settled low along the river. By the time I reached the first town with a gas station, I felt like I could finally breathe. I bought a coffee, sat for a while, and called the rental agency to let them know I wouldn't be returning the keys. Looking back, I still don't know exactly what was out there in those woods. No one else saw it, and the authorities didn't find anything when they eventually checked the cabin. Maybe it was a squatter, maybe someone watching the isolated area for a long time. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I know what I felt: the presence, the deliberate movements around the cabin, the footprints. I never returned to that area, and I stopped taking solo trips into isolated forests after that. The experience left a mark, a constant reminder of how quickly solitude can turn from peace to fear. But in the end, I made it back safely. I survived by trusting my instincts, by not letting curiosity get the better of me when it mattered most. And for the first time, I understood how vulnerable humans are when alone in the wilderness. That trip changed the way I approached life. I never let myself be completely unprepared again. I always check who might be around, where I am, and I respect the silence and isolation in ways I never did before. The memory of that cabin, the dark trees, the unknown steps circling my small wooden refuge, stays with me. But so does the relief of getting out, of returning to safety, and of knowing that sometimes the only thing you can control is your own vigilance. It was the summer of 1987 when I first decided to leave the noise of the city behind for a few weeks. I was 26, tired of fluorescent office lights and the constant hum of traffic, craving the kind of silence you can't find anywhere near Chicago. I rented a small cabin in the northern part of Minnesota, nestled near the border with Canada. The cabin itself was a squat, wooden building with a sagging roof and peeling paint, sitting at the edge of a thick pine forest. The owner had warned me that the area was remote, with no cell service and limited road access, but I liked the idea. I wanted to be alone, and this place promised exactly that. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low and burning orange over the treetops. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow and full of potholes, flanked on both sides by dense forest. The further I drove, the more the world seemed to close in around me. The sound of my car was the only thing breaking the quiet. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon. The building looked exactly like the pictures. Small, rough-hewn logs, a single porch with a swing that creaked when the wind moved it. The door was unlocked, just as the owner said. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and dust, with cobwebs in the corners and a faint smell of mold near the floorboards. There was a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a sink, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. The bedroom had a simple bed, and the bathroom was just a shower stall, toilet, and sink. I set my bag down and took a deep breath, already feeling the tension of city life slipping away. That first night, I lit a small lantern and cooked some pasta. The cabin was still and dark once the sun fully disappeared, the kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. I went to bed early, thinking I would wake up refreshed for a long hike the next morning. But I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint noise, something like a dragging sound outside, followed by a thump. I froze, listening. There was nothing. No wind, no animals, just the occasional groan of the cabin settling. I told myself it was a raccoon, maybe a deer, and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, the forest seemed alive in a different way. Birds called from the treetops, but deeper in the pines, it was eerily quiet. I explored the trails behind the cabin, taking in the dense greenery, the occasional glint of sunlight through the leaves, and the smell of pine resin. I passed a small stream and crouched to watch a turtle slip into the water. Everything seemed peaceful, almost perfect. But as I hiked further, I noticed tracks in the mud, large, human-like footprints leading into the woods from the cabin's direction. I stopped and stared. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal prints either. Unease settled over me, but I convinced myself that someone else must have a cabin nearby, or maybe a hunter had wandered by. That night, I double-checked the locks and lit the lantern. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again, a faint, slow scratching at the door. My heart pounded and I held my breath. The scratching stopped after a few moments, and then there was silence. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the dark with the lantern burning low, every shadow outside seeming to move, every branch scraping against the cabin walls like fingers. The next morning, I found something unsettling on the porch. A single muddy boot print, fresh, leading up to the door and stopping at the threshold. My blood ran cold. I checked every window and door. Everything was locked, but the print was undeniable. I thought about calling someone, but there was no cell service, and I had no landline. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to draw attention to myself out here. I spent the day cautiously outside, keeping my eyes on the tree line, noticing every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth. Around mid-afternoon, I heard something that made me stop dead. From deep in the forest, I could hear someone walking. Heavy steps, deliberate, slow, moving closer. I ducked behind a tree and watched. The sound stopped. Nothing moved. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. Someone was there, watching, just out of sight. By the third night, I was on edge. I had started keeping a large kitchen knife with me at all times. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows, and every groan of the old wood sounded like someone trying to break in. I slept fitfully in short bursts, waking at odd hours to check the doors and the surrounding darkness. That night, the worst happened. I woke to the sound of the back door handle rattling. My heart felt like it would burst. I grabbed the knife and crept to the door, listening. The rattling stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Then, slow, deliberate steps walked around the cabin. Not fast like an animal, but careful, human steps. I could hear the crunch of sticks, the soft brush of leaves against boots. I spent the entire night awake, sitting against the wall, the knife in my hands. When the sun finally rose, I went outside cautiously. The yard was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone, only the tracks from the previous day and the odd broken branch that hadn't been there before. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly and drove down the winding gravel road, constantly checking the treeline. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't look back until I was safely on the highway. Years later, I found out the area had a reputation for people living off the grid, sometimes squatters who had no intention of being found. Most were harmless, but some had violent tendencies, desperate and territorial. I realized that I had probably stumbled too close to one of them. My fear had been real, not imagined, and I had survived because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and left as soon as I could. The cabin itself was eventually sold to someone else. I never went back, but I sometimes think about it, about the silence that wasn't really silence, about the feeling of being watched in a place that should have been peaceful. I know now that nature isn't always kind, but the people who hide in it can be even less so. That experience changed the way I travel. I still love remote places, but I never underestimate the dangers of being completely alone in the woods. I learned to trust my instincts, to notice the small signs that something isn't right, and to leave before curiosity turns into danger. And that summer, in that small Minnesota cabin, I learned that fear doesn't have to come from ghosts or fairy tales. It can come from something very real, very human, and very close.